Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes. Book 4, Chapter 1. The fate of the Usipetes and Tencteri, Caesar's first invasion of Britain. In the following winter, the year in which Gnaeus Pompeius and Marcus Crassus were consuls, a German tribe, the Usipetes, accompanied by the Tencteri, crossed the Rhine in large numbers, not far from the point where it enters the sea. Their motive was that for several years they had been subject to harassing attacks from the Suebi, and prevented from tilling the land. The Suebi are by far the most numerous and warlike of all the German peoples. They are said to comprise 100 clans, each of which annually sends 1,000 armed men on a military expedition beyond the frontier. The rest of the population remain at home, and support the expeditionary force as well as themselves. Next year they take up arms in their turn, and the others remain at home. Thus agriculture goes on uninterruptedly, along with theoretical and practical training in war. Private property in land, however, does not exist, and no one is allowed to remain for farming in one spot longer than a year. Not much corn, indeed, is consumed. The people live principally on milk and flesh meat, and spend much time in hunting. This, combined with the nature of their food, their constant exercise and freedom from restraint, for they have never from childhood been made to obey or subjected to discipline, and never do anything against their inclination, fosters their bodily vigor and produces a race of gigantic stature. Moreover, they have trained themselves to wear no clothing, even in the coldest districts, except skins, which leave a large part of the body bare, and to bathe in the rivers. 2. Traders are allowed to enter their country, not because they want to import anything, but that they may find purchasers for their booty. Even horses, of which the Gauls are extremely fond, and to procure which they go to great expense, are not imported by the Germans. The native horses are undersized and ugly, but by constant exercise they develop in themselves extraordinary powers of endurance. In cavalry combats they often dismount and fight on foot, training their horses to stand still, and quickly remounting when necessary. According to their notions, nothing is more shameful or unmanly than the use of saddles, and so, however small their numbers, they are ready to encounter any number of cavalry who use them. They will not allow wine to be imported at all, considering that its use enfeebles a man's power of endurance, and makes him effeminate. 3. The communities as such pride themselves on keeping the land round their own borders uninhabited as far as possible, regarding it as a proof that many tribes are unable to cope with them. Thus it is said that on one side of the Sueban territory there is an uninhabited tract extending about 600 miles. On the opposite side their neighbours are the Ubi, who were once a considerable tribe, and according to German standards a flourishing tribe. They are in fact rather more civilized than the rest of the nation, for they are near the Rhine. Their country is much frequented by traders, and from propinquity they have become familiarized with Gallic customs. The Suebi, after many campaigns and frequent attempts, had found them too numerous and powerful to be dispossessed, but they made them tributary and reduced them to comparative insignificance and weakness. 4. The Usipetes and Tencteri, mentioned above, were in the same position. For several years they withstood the pressure of the Suebi, but at length they were dispossessed, and after wandering for many years through many parts of Germany, came to the Rhine. The Menapii inhabited that region, and owned lands, homesteads, and villages on both sides of the river, but alarmed by the incursion of this large host, they abandoned their dwellings on the further bank, established outposts on this side of the Rhine, and determined to prevent the Germans from crossing. The latter tried every expedient, but being unable to force a passage from want of boats, or to get across unobserved because of the Menapian patrols, pretended to return to the district where they had settled, marched on for 3 days, and then turned back again. Their cavalry made the whole journey in a single night, and swooped down upon the Menapii, who, knowing nothing of their movements, were off their guard, and having been informed by their patrols that they had gone off, had fearlessly recrossed the Rhine and returned to their villages. The Germans slaughtered them, seized their boats, crossed the river before the Menappi on this side of the Rhine could tell what they were about, took possession of all their buildings, and for the rest of the winter lived on their stores. 5. The unstable character of the Gauls caused Caesar anxiety, for they do not abide by their decisions, and are generally prone to revolution. Accordingly, when he learned the facts, he thought it best not to rely upon them at all. It is a custom of theirs to detain travellers, even against their will, and question them individually about what they have heard or ascertained on this or that topic. And in the towns the people cluster round traders, and make them say where they come from, and tell them the news. Influenced by these reports, even when they are merely hearsay, they often embark upon the most momentous enterprises, and as they trust blindly to vague gossip, and their informants generally tell lies and frame their answers to please them, they naturally repent of their plans as soon as they are formed. 6. Caesar was aware of this custom, and to avoid having a serious war on his hands, he started to rejoin his army earlier than usual. On his arrival he found that his forebodings were justified. Embassies had been sent by more than one tribe to the Germans, inviting them to quit the neighbourhood of the Rhine, and promising to supply all their requirements. Allured by this prospect, they were now wandering further afield, and had reached the territories of the Eburones and Condrusi, both dependents of the Treveri. Caesar summoned the Gallic notables, and thinking it well to dissemble what he knew, addressed them in soothing and reassuring terms, directed them to furnish cavalry, and announced his intention of taking the field against the Germans. 7. After arranging for a supply of grain, and selecting troopers from the several contingents, he began his march towards the districts in which he heard that the Germans were encamped. When he was within a few days' march from them, their envoys arrived, and addressed him as follows. The Germans were not the aggressors, but if they were provoked they would not shrink from a contest with the Roman people, for it was a principle of theirs, handed down by their forefathers, to resist all who attacked them, and not to sue for mercy. Still this much they would say, they had come reluctantly because they had been driven from their country. If the Romans cared for their goodwill, their friendship might be of use to them. Let the Romans either assign them lands, or suffer them to retain those which they had won by the sword. They acknowledged the superiority of the Suebi alone, for even the immortal gods were no match for them, and there was no other people upon earth whom they could not overcome. 8. Caesar made a suitable reply. The upshot of his speech was that there could be no friendship between him and the Germans if they remained in Gaul. It was not reasonable for people who could not defend their own territories to take possession of those of others, and besides, there were no unoccupied lands in Gaul which could be made over to any people, least of all to one so numerous, without injustice. Still, they might settle, if they wished, in the country of the Ubi, whose envoys were with him, complaining of the ill treatment of the Suebi, and asking for his aid, and he would order the Ubi to receive them. 9. The envoys said that they would refer this offer to their principals, and after it had been considered, would return to Caesar in 3 days. Meanwhile they requested him not to move nearer. Caesar told them that it was impossible for him to make even this concession. He had ascertained that a large detachment of their cavalry had been sent across the Meuse some days before to the country of the Ambiviarti, to plunder and forage, and he believed that they were waiting for their return, and that was their motive for trying to gain time. 10. The Meuse rises in the Vosges mountains, which are in the territory of the Lingones, receives an affluent called the Wall from the Rhine, thereby forming the island of the Batavi, and not more than 80 miles from that point flows into the ocean. The Rhine rises in the country of the Leponti, who inhabit the Alps, and flows swiftly for a long distance through the territories of the Nantuetes, Helvetii, Sequani, Mediomatrici, Trebosi, and Treveri. As it approaches the sea, it branches off into several channels, and forms numerous large islands, many of which are inhabited by fierce, rude tribes, some of whom are supposed to live on fish and birds' eggs, and discharges itself by numerous outlets into the ocean. 11. When Caesar was not more than 12 miles from the enemy, their envoys returned to him according to agreement, and meeting him on his march, earnestly entreated him to advance no farther. As they could not induce him to comply, they begged him to send word to the cavalry which had gone on in advance of the column, forbidding them to fight, and to let them send envoys to the Ubi, declaring that if their council and chiefs swore to keep faith with them, they would avail themselves of the terms which he offered, and asking him to give them 3 days to complete the arrangements. Caesar believed that all these stipulations had the same object, to secure 3 days' delay for the return of the absent cavalry. Still, he said that he would advance 4 miles and no more that day, to get water. On the morrow as many of them as could come were to assemble at his halting place, that he might take cognizance of their request. Meanwhile, he sent messengers to tell the cavalry officers, who had gone on in front of their whole force, not to attack the enemy, and in case they were attacked themselves, to remain on the defensive till he came up with the rest of the army. 12. Our cavalry, who numbered 5,000, felt no anxiety, as the German envoys had asked for an armistice for that day, and he had only just left Caesar. The moment the enemy caught sight of them, although they had not more than 800 horse, those who had crossed the Meuse to forage not having yet returned, they charged and speedily threw them into confusion, and when they rallied, the enemy, following their regular practice, sprang to the ground, stabbed their horses in the belly, and unhorsed a number of our men. They charged and speedily threw them into confusion, and when they rallied, the enemy, following their regular practice, sprang to the ground, stabbed the horses in the belly, and unhorsed a number of our men, sent the rest flying, and swept them along in such panic that they never drew rein till they came in sight of our column. 74 of our troopers were killed in the affair, including Piso, a gallant Aquitanian of the most illustrious family, whose grandfather had been honored by the Senate with the title of friend, and had held sovereignty in his own tribe. His brother was surrounded by the enemy, but he went to his assistance and rescued him, and though his horse was wounded and he was thrown, he resisted most gallantly as long as he could. Surrounded and covered with wounds, he fell, when his brother, who had by this time got away from the press and was some distance off, saw what had happened, and putting spurs to his horse, rode straight against the enemy and perished. 13. After this combat, Caesar no longer felt bound to listen to the envoys, or to entertain the proposals of a people who, after asking for peace, had made a treacherous, insidious, and unprovoked attack. On the other hand, he thought that it would be the height of folly to wait till the enemy were reinforced by the return of their cavalry. From his knowledge of the unstable character of the Gauls, he realized that the enemy, by a single victory, had already gained great prestige with them, and he thought it best to give them no time to form their plans. Having come to this decision, he communicated to his quaestor and generals his determination not to lose a day in forcing on a battle, when a most fortunate event occurred. Next day, early in the morning, a numerous deputation of the Germans, comprising all the leading men and all those of mature age, came to the camp, in the same spirit of treachery and deceit, to wait upon him. Their ostensible object was to clear themselves from complicity in the attack which had taken place the day before, contrary to the agreement which they had themselves asked for. At the same time they intended, if possible, to gain an extension of the armistice on some pretext. Caesar was delighted that they had put themselves in his power, and ordered them to be detained. He then marched out of camp at the head of his whole force, ordering the cavalry, whom he believed to be demoralized by the recent combat, to bring up the rear. 14. Forming the army in 3 lines, he made a rapid march of 8 miles, and reached the enemy's camp before the Germans could realize what was going to happen. The rapidity of our advance and the absence of their leaders suddenly and completely unnerved them. There was no time to consider or to arm, and they were too distracted to know whether it was best to throw their strength against the enemy, to defend the camp, or to fly for their lives. Their terror was manifested by cries and hurried movements, and the soldiers, exasperated by the treachery of the previous day, burst into the camp. Those who were quick enough to seize their weapons made a brief stand there against our men, fighting under cover of their wagons and baggage, But the host of women and children, for they had left their country and crossed the Rhine with all their belongings, began to flee in all directions, and Caesar sent his cavalry to hunt them down. 15. The Germans heard the shrieks behind, and seeing that their kith and kin were being slaughtered, threw away their weapons, abandoned their standards, and rushed out of the camp. When they reached the confluence of the Moselle and the Rhine, great numbers were already killed, and the rest, giving up all hope of escape, plunged into the stream and there perished, overcome by terror, weariness, and the force of the current. Our men had anxiously anticipated an arduous struggle, for the enemy's numbers had amounted to 430,000, but all to a man returned safe to camp with only a very few wounded. Caesar gave the prisoners whom he had detained in camp the option of going free, but as they were afraid of being punished and tortured by the Gauls whose lands they had ravaged, they said that they would prefer to remain with him, and he permitted them to do so. End of chapter 15.
Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes, Book 4, Chapter 16. The campaign against the Germans being concluded, Caesar thought it advisable for many reasons to cross the Rhine. The most cogent reason was this. Observing that the Germans were so ready to invade Gaul, he desired to make them feel alarm on their own account, and realize that the army of the Roman people could and would cross the Rhine. There was another consideration. That division of the cavalry of the Usipetes and Tencteri which, as I have already related, had crossed the Meuse to plunder and forage, and had taken no part in the action, had recrossed the Rhine after the rout of their countrymen, taken refuge in the territory of the Sugambri, and joined forces with them. When Caesar sent envoys to the Sugambri, calling upon them to deliver up the fugitives, on the ground that they had made war upon him and upon Gaul, they replied that the Rhine was the limit of Roman dominion. If Caesar thought that the Germans had no right to cross over into Gaul without his permission, how could he claim any authority or power beyond the Rhine? The Ubii, on the other hand, who alone among the Transrhenane peoples had sent envoys to Caesar, entered into friendly relations with him, and, given hostages, earnestly entreated him to help them, as they were hard pressed by the Suebi, or if he were prevented from doing so by reasons of state, merely to throw his army across the Rhine, which would be sufficient to support them and assure their prospects for the future. The name and fame which his army had gained, even with the most distant German peoples, by defeating Ariovistus, and by this recent victory, were so great that they could safely rely on the prestige and friendship of the Roman people. At the same time, they promised to provide a large flotilla of boats for the passage of the army. Caesar was determined to cross the Rhine for the reasons which I have mentioned, but he thought it hardly safe to cross in boats, and considered that to do so would not be consistent with his own dignity or that of the Roman people. Therefore, although the construction of a bridge presented great difficulties on account of the breadth, swiftness, and depth of the stream, he nevertheless thought it best to make the attempt, or else not to cross at all. The principle upon which he designed the bridge was as follows. He took a couple of piles a foot and a half thick, had them sharpened to a point from a little above the lower end, and adapted in length to the varying depth of the river, and fastened them together at an interval of 2 feet. These piles he caused to be lowered into the river by means of floats, fixed and driven home with pile drivers, not vertically like ordinary piles, but leaning forward in the same plane, so that they followed the direction of the current. Then he had another couple of piles, similarly joined together, planted opposite them on the lower side at a distance of 40 feet, against the force and rush of the current. Beams 2 feet wide, fitting into the interval between the piles of each couple, were laid across, and the two couples were kept apart by a pair of braces on either side of the extremity. The couples being thus kept apart, and on the other hand held firmly in place, the strength of the structure was so great, and its principle so ordered, that the greater the force of the current, the more closely were the piles locked together. The series of piles and transverse beams was connected by timbers laid in the direction of the bridge, which were floored with poles and fascines. Finally, notwithstanding the existing strength of the structure, piles were also driven in diagonally on the downstream side, which were connected with the entire structure and planted below like a buttress, so as to break the force of the stream. Other piles were likewise planted a little above the bridge, so that in case the natives floated down trunks of trees or barges to demolish the structure, their force might be weakened by these bulwarks, and they might not injure the bridge. Within 10 days after the collection of the timber began, the whole work was finished, and the army crossed over. Caesar left a strong force at both ends of the bridge, and marched rapidly for the country of the Sugambri. Meanwhile, envoys came in from several tribes, and Caesar replied graciously to their prayer for peace and friendship, and directed them to bring him hostages. The Sugambri, on the contrary, from the moment when the construction of the bridge began, acting on the advice from the Tencteri and Usipetes, whom they were entertaining, had prepared for flight, left their country with all their belongings, and hidden themselves in the recesses of the forest. Caesar remained a few days in their country, burned all their villages and homesteads, cut down their corn, and returned to the territory of the Ubii. Promising to help them in case they were molested by the Subii, he ascertained from them that the latter, on learning from their scouts that the bridge was being made, had called a council according to their custom, and sent messengers in all directions bidding the people to abandon the strongholds, convey their wives and children and all their belongings into the forest, and assemble, all of them who could bear arms, at a fixed place nearly in the center of the region occupied by the Subii. Here they were awaiting the arrival of the Romans, and here they had determined to fight a decisive battle. Caesar had achieved every object for which he had determined to lead his army across: overawed the Germans, punished the Sugambri, and relieved the Ubii from hostile pressure. He felt that honor was satisfied, and that he had served every useful purpose. When, therefore, he heard the news about the Subii, he returned to Gaul, having spent just 18 days on the further side of the Rhine, and destroyed the bridge. End of chapter 19. Commentaries on the Gallic War by Julius Caesar, translated by Thomas Rice Holmes, Book 4, Chapter 20. Only a small part of the summer remained, and in these parts, the whole of Gaul having a northerly trend, winter sets in early. Nevertheless, Caesar made active preparations for an expedition to Britain, for he knew that in almost all the operations in Gaul, our enemies had been reinforced from that country. Besides, if there were not time for a campaign, he thought that it would be well worth his while merely to visit the island, see what the people were like, and make himself acquainted with the features of the country, the harbors, and the landing places. For of all this the Gauls knew practically nothing. No one, indeed, readily undertakes the voyage to Britain except traders, and even they know nothing of it except the coast and the parts opposite the different regions of Gaul. Accordingly, though Caesar summoned traders from all parts to meet him, he could not ascertain the extent of the island, what tribes dwelt therein, their strength, their method of fighting, their manners and customs, or what harbors were capable of accommodating a large flotilla. To procure information on these points before risking the attempt, he sent Gaius Volusenus, whom he considered perfectly competent, with the galley, instructing him to make a thorough reconnaissance and return as soon as possible. At the same time he marched with his whole force for the country of the Morini, as the shortest passage to Britain was from their coast, and ordered ships to assemble there from all the ports in the adjacent districts, as well as the fleet which he had built in the previous summer for the war with the Veneti. Meanwhile his design became known, and was reported by traders to the Britons, whereupon envoys came to him from several tribes of the island, promising to give hostages and to submit to the authority of the Roman people. On hearing what they had to say, Caesar graciously reassured them, and sent them home, enjoining them to abide by their resolve. Along with them he sent Commius, whom, after the overthrow of the Atrebates, he had set up as king over that people, a man of whose energy and judgment he had a high opinion, whom he believed to be loyal, and who was reputed to have great influence in the country. He instructed him to visit all the tribes he could, to urge them to trust in the good faith of the Roman people, and to announce that Caesar would soon arrive. Volusenus reconnoitred all the features of the coast as far as he could get the chance, for he could not venture to disembark and trust himself to the natives, and in 5 days returned to Caesar and reported his observations. While Caesar was waiting in these parts to get his ships ready for sea, envoys came from a large section of the Morini to apologize for their recent conduct in attacking the Roman people and promise obedience to his commands, pleading that they were uncivilized and knew nothing of our ways. Caesar regarded this as most opportune, for he had no wish to leave an enemy in his rear. Owing to the time of the year he had no means of undertaking a campaign, and he did not think it wise to postpone his expedition to Britain for trivialities. Accordingly, he ordered the envoys to furnish a large number of hostages, and on their arrival admitted the Morini to terms. About 80 transports, which he considered sufficient to convey 2 legions, were collected and assembled. The galleys, which he had besides, he assigned to the quaestor, the generals, and the auxiliary officers. Besides these, there were 18 transports, 8 miles off, which were prevented from making the same harbor by contrary winds. These he assigned to the cavalry, placing the rest of the army under the command of 2 generals, Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta, with orders to march against the Menapii and those clans of the Morini from which no envoys had come. He directed another general, Publius Sulpicius Rufus, to hold the port with a force which he considered adequate. The arrangements were now complete, and, taking advantage of favorable weather, he set sail about the 3rd watch, directing the cavalry to march to the further harbor, embark there, and follow him. They were rather dilatory in getting through their work, but Caesar, with the leading ships, reached Britain about the 4th hour, and there, standing in full view on all the heights, he saw an armed force of the enemy. The formation of the ground was peculiar, the sea being so closely walled in by abrupt heights that it was possible to throw a missile from the ground above on to the shore. Caesar thought the place most unsuitable for landing, and accordingly remained till the 9th hour, waiting at anchor for the other ships to join him. Meanwhile he assembled the generals and tribunes, told them what he had learned from Volusenus, and explained his own plans, charging them to bear in mind the requirements of war, and particularly of seamanship, involving as it did rapid and irregular movements, and to see that all orders were carried out smartly and at the right moment. The officers dispersed, and, getting wind and tide together in his favor, Caesar gave the signal, weighed anchor, and sailing on about 7 miles further, ran the ships aground on an open and evenly shelving shore. The natives knew what the Romans intended, sending on ahead their cavalry and charioteers, a kind of warriors whom they habitually employ in action. They followed with the rest of their force, and attempted to prevent our men from disembarking. It was very difficult to land for these reasons. The size of the ships made it impossible for them to ground except in deep water. The soldiers did not know the ground, and, with their hands loaded and weighted by their heavy, cumbrous armor, they had to jump down from the ships, keep their foothold in the surf, and fight the enemy all at once. While the enemy had all their limbs free, they knew the ground perfectly, and, standing on dry land or moving forward a little into the water, they threw their missiles boldly and drove their horses into the sea which they were trained to enter. Our men were unnerved by the situation, and, having no experience of this kind of warfare, they did not show the same dash and energy that they generally did in battles on land. Caesar, noticing this, ordered the galleys, with the look of which the natives were not familiar, and which were easier to handle, to sheer off a little from the transports, row hard, and range alongside of the enemy's flanks, and slingers, archers, and artillery to shoot from their decks and drive the enemy out of the way. This maneuver was of great service to our men, for the natives, alarmed by the build of the ships, the motion of the oars, and the strangeness of the artillery, stood still, and then drew back a little, And now, as our soldiers were hesitating, chiefly because of the depth of the water, the standard-bearer of the 10th, praying that his attempt might redound to the success of the legion, cried, "Leap down, men, unless you want to abandon the eagle to the enemy. I, at all events, shall have done my duty to my country and my general." Uttering these words in a loud voice, he threw himself overboard, and advanced bearing the eagle against the enemy. Then, calling upon each other not to suffer such a disgrace, the men leaped all together from the ship. Seeing this, their comrades in the nearest ships followed them and advanced close up to the enemy. Both sides fought with spirit, but the Romans, being unable to keep their ranks unbroken, or get firm foothold, or follow their respective standards, and as they came from this or that ship, joining any standard they met, became greatly confused, while the enemy knew all the shallows, and when from their standpoint on shore they saw a few men disembarking one by one, urged on their horses, and surrounding the little group in numbers, attacked them before they were ready. Others again got on the exposed flank of an entire company and plied them with missiles. Caesar, noticing this, ordered the men of war's boats and also the scouts to be manned, and whenever he saw any of his men in difficulties, sent them to the rescue. Our men, as soon as they got upon dry land, followed by all their comrades, charged the enemy and put them to flight, but could not pursue them far because the cavalry had not been able to keep their course and make the island. This was the only drawback to Caesar's usual good fortune. The beaten enemy, on rallying after their flight, at once sent envoys to Caesar to sue for peace, promising to give hostages and to obey his commands. The envoys were accompanied by the Atrebatian Commius, who, as I have already related, had been sent on by Caesar to Britain in advance. He had just landed, and, in the character of an envoy, was conveying Caesar's mandates to the Britons, when they seized him and locked him with chains. But now, after the battle, they sent him back, and, while suing for peace, laid the blame of the outrage upon the rabble, and begged that it might be overlooked in consideration of their ignorance. Caesar complained that after the Britons had spontaneously sent envoys to the continent and asked him for peace, they had attacked him without provocation, but said that he would pardon their ignorance and demanded hostages. Part of the required number they handed over at once, saying that they had to fetch the rest from long distances, and would deliver them in a few days. Meanwhile they ordered their followers to go back to their districts, while chiefs began to come in from all parts, and place themselves and their tribes under Caesar's protection. Peace had been thus established when, 3 days after the expedition reached Britain, the 18 ships mentioned above, which had taken the cavalry on board, sailed from the upper port with a light breeze. They were getting close to Britain, and were seen from the camp, when such a violent storm suddenly arose that none of them could keep their course, but some were carried back to the point from which they had started, while the others were swept down in great peril to the lower and more westerly part of the island. They anchored, notwithstanding, but as they were becoming waterlogged, were forced to stand out to sea in the face of night and make for the continent. The same night it happened to be full moon, which generally causes very high tides in the ocean, a fact of which our men were not aware. The result was that the galleys, in which Caesar had brought over troops, and which he had drawn up on dry land, were waterlogged, while the transports which were at anchor were damaged by the storm, and the men were unable to be of any service or go to their assistance. Several ships were wrecked, the rest were rendered useless by the loss of their rigging, anchors, and other fittings, and naturally the whole army was seized by panic. There were no other ships to take them back. Everything required for repairing ships was lacking, and as the troops all understood that they would have to winter in Gaul, no corn for the winter had been provided on the spot. When this became known, the British chiefs who had waited on Caesar after the battle took counsel together. They knew that the Romans had neither cavalry nor ships nor grain, and they gathered that their troops were few from the smallness of the camp, which, as Caesar had taken over the legions without heavy baggage, was extraordinarily contracted. They therefore concluded that their best course would be to renew hostilities, cut off our men from corn and other supplies, and protract the campaign till winter, being confident that if they overpowered them or prevented their return, no invader would ever again come over to Britain. Accordingly, they renewed their oaths of mutual fidelity, and began to move away one by one from the camp, and to fetch their tribesmen secretly from the districts. Caesar was not yet aware of their plans, but from what had happened to his ships, and from the fact that the chiefs had left off sending hostages, he guessed what was coming. Accordingly, he prepared for all contingencies. He had corn brought in daily from the fields into camp, utilized the timber and bronze belonging to the ships that had been most severely damaged to repair the rest, and ordered everything required for the purpose to be brought over from the continent. The men worked with hearty good will, and thus, although 12 ships were lost, he managed to have the rest made tolerably seaworthy. Meanwhile, a legion known as the 7th was sent out in the ordinary course to fetch corn. So far no one had suspected that hostilities were brewing, for some of the natives still remained in the districts, while others were actually passing in and out of the camp. But the troops on guard in front of the gates of the camp reported to Caesar that an unusual amount of dust was to be seen in the direction in which the legion had gone. Suspecting, with good reason as it happened, that the natives had hatched some scheme, Caesar ordered the cohorts on guard to accompany him in the direction indicated, 2 of the others to relieve them, and the rest to arm and follow him immediately. He had advanced some little distance from the camp when he observed that his troops were hard pressed by the enemy and could barely hold their own, the legion being huddled together and missiles hurled in from all sides. All the corn had been cut except in this one spot, and the enemy, anticipating that the Romans would come here, had laid in wait in the woods during the night. Then, when the troops had laid aside their weapons and were dispersed and busy reaping, they had suddenly fallen upon them. A few were killed, the rest, whose ranks were not properly formed, were thrown into confusion, and the enemy's horse and war chariots had at the same time encompassed them. Chariots are used in action in the following way. First of all, the charioteers drive all over the field, the warriors hurling missiles, and generally they throw the enemy's ranks into confusion by the mere terror inspired by their horses and the clatter of the wheels. As soon as they have penetrated between the troops of cavalry, the warriors jump off the chariots and fight on foot. The drivers meanwhile gradually withdraw from the action and range the cars in such a position that, if the warriors are hard pressed by the enemy's numbers, they may easily get back to them. Thus they exhibit in action the mobility of cavalry combined with the steadiness of infantry, and they become so efficient from constant practice and training that they will drive their horses at full gallop, keeping them well in hand down a steep incline, check and turn them in an instant, run along the pole, stand on the yoke, and step backwards again to the cars with the greatest nimbleness. Our men were unnerved by these movements because the tactics were new to them, and Caesar came to their support in the nick of time. When he came up, the enemy stood still, and our men recovered from their alarm. Thinking, however, that the moment was not favorable for challenging the enemy and forcing on a battle, he simply maintained his position, and, after a short interval, withdrew the legions into camp. During these operations our people were all busy, and the rest of the Britons who were still in their districts left them. Stormy weather followed for several days running, which kept the troops in camp and prevented the enemy from attacking. Meantime the natives sent messengers in all directions, telling their tribesmen that our troops were few, and pointing out that they had an excellent opportunity for plundering and establishing their independence for good by driving the Romans from their camp. By these representations they speedily got together a large body of horse and foot, and advanced against the camp. Caesar foresaw that what had happened on previous days would happen again. Even if the enemy were beaten, their mobility would enable them to get off scot-free. However, he luckily obtained about 30 horsemen, whom the Atrebatian Commius, already mentioned, had taken over with him, and drew up the legions in front of the camp. A battle followed, and the enemy, unable to stand long against the onset of our troops, turned and fled. The troops pursued them as far as their speed and endurance would permit, and killed a good many of them. Then, after burning all the buildings far and wide, they returned to camp. On the same day the enemy sent envoys who came to Caesar to sue for peace. He ordered them to find twice as many hostages as before, and take them across to the continent. For the equinox was near, and as his ships were unsound, he did not think it wise to risk a stormy passage. Taking advantage of favorable weather, he set sail a little after midnight. All the ships reached the continent in safety, but 2 transports were unable to make the same harbors as the rest, and drifted a little further down. About 300 infantry had landed from these 2 vessels, and were making the best of their way to camp, when the Morini, who had been quite submissive when Caesar left them on his departure for Britain, surrounded them in the hope of plunder, and told them if they did not want to be killed, to lay down their arms. The Morini were not very numerous at first, but when the soldiers formed square and defended themselves, about 6,000, hearing the uproar, quickly assembled. On receiving the news, Caesar sent all his cavalry from camp to rescue his men. Meanwhile, our soldiers sustained the enemy's onslaught and fought most gallantly for more than 4 hours. A few of them were wounded, but they killed many of their assailants. After our cavalry came in sight, the enemy threw away their arms and fled, and a large number of them were cut to pieces. Next day Caesar sent Titus Labienus, in command of the legions which he had brought back from Britain, to punish the rebellious Morini. The marshes, which had served them as a refuge in the previous year, were dried up, and having no place to escape to, almost all of them fell into the hands of Labienus. Quintus Titurius and Lucius Cotta, the generals who had led the other legions into the country of the Menapii, finding that they had all taken refuge in the thickest part of their forests, ravaged all their lands, cut their corn, burned their homesteads, and returned to Caesar, who quartered all the legions for the winter in the country of the Belgae. Thither 2 British tribes, and no more, sent hostages. The rest neglected to do so. In honor of these achievements, the Senate, on receiving Caesar's dispatches, appointed a thanksgiving service of 20 days. End of chapter 38.